Good evening, everyone. My name is Jay Krylik. I work with the WildWest Institute. I'm the restoration coordinator, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the third installment of the Northern Rockies Nature Forum Fall Series. These forums are hosted by the WildWest Institute and the environmental action community, are free, and are community-oriented discussions on ecology, biodiversity, restoration, and the future of natural landscapes in the Northern Rockies bioregion. Tonight's forum is entitled Actualizing Montana's Restoration Economy. The format of the forum will be short presentations by each speaker, followed by moderated question and answer from the audience. So you will have time to chime in and ask speakers what you want to know. I'll also say that our next forum is slated for November 14th. It's on climate change and the Northern Rockies. The speakers for that are David Mildrexler, Lance Olson, and David Merrill. So that's on November 14th. Our first speaker tonight is Dan Spencer. He's an assistant professor of environmental studies here at the University of Montana, where he has taught since 2002. His areas of teaching and research include ecological ethics, ethical issues in ecological restoration, globalization, justice, social justice, and environmental issues in Latin America. For 10 years, beginning in 1993, Dan was professor of religion and ethics at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. He was born and raised in California and received his BA in geology from Carleton College in Minnesota in 1979, and his master's and PhD in environmental ethics from Union Theological Seminary in New York. He's currently working on a collection of essays that connect ecological location, restoration, and ethics. And he has worked on human rights and environmental issues in Latin America since first living there in 1978. He also worked for a number of years at the Center for Global Education at Augsburg College in Minneapolis, Minnesota. His partner, Pat Burke, is a restoration ecologist and founder of Bitter Restoration in Corvallis, Montana. And with that, I'll give you Dan Spencer.
Thanks. Jake, should I wear the microphone?
No, I don't think you...
Can you all hear me, Andy? You all can hear me okay? But I'll try to project on stuff. But if anybody has problems hearing me, let me know. I'm really delighted to be here. This is an area that I just find absolutely fascinating and really important for Montana, this whole notion of building an economy around restoration. When Matthew Kaler, Jake's colleague, asked me to speak tonight, he asked me to spend some time actually talking about what we mean by restoration. And I'm going to put a plug in for thinking about restoration as rooted in ecological restoration. I'll talk a little bit about that here. So what I'd like to do tonight is set a little bit of the context for how this conversation is emerging in Montana, then define ecological restoration, and give us some groundwork, a place to stop from. I think there are broader forms of restoration than simply ecological restoration, but I also think ecological restoration needs to be the grounding and the core when we start talking about a restoration economy. As an ethicist, I'm always interested in the question of good and goodness and what makes restoration good restoration. So I want to talk about some criteria that I think can help guide us when we start talking about shaping a restoration economy. What would make the restoration part of it good restoration? And then end on this just note of raising the question, what would a restoration vision for Montana look like? So some preliminary thoughts on this. This conversation comes in large part out of the Governor's Restoration Forum that took place in Billings in early June, when Governor Schweitzer brought together 200 or 300 folks to talk to each other about the vision of restoration and what that might look like. And I was fortunate to be part of some of the initial planning meetings at the University of Montana with Jim Birchfield, the Associate Dean in College of Forestry and Conservation, and others to think about why this Governor's Restoration was so timely. We had at least a couple initial thoughts. One of us, it gave us the opportunity to rethink our place in and on the land and address this question: how do we meet our goals of healthy communities, watersheds, lands, and forests? Montana has reached a point where there seems to be broad consensus that healthy communities and healthy ecosystems are deeply interrelated. We're increasingly aware that we won't have one without the other. And so the more difficult question is how to reach that goal. One promising route is to develop a vision for Montana that's rooted in restoration. So this restoration vision we talked about as being both hopeful and humble, an ethical partnership with the land and the land's ecological integrity. Jim Birchfield termed this restoration vision as both hopeful and humble. It's hopeful because never before in Montana's history have we had both the scientific knowledge and technology and the political will to carry out restoration at a broad scale. I think those things are coming together at this time now. But it's also humble because there's still so much we don't know and probably can never know about restoring complex ecosystems. And given our history of degrading the land for human use, a healthy dose of humility in the face of nature would seem to be a wise starting point. But it's a hopeful time as well. And I hope our conversation tonight will begin to address the hope that the three of us and the people in the audience see in that. So our immediate context for this conversation of restoration economy, I would locate again in the governor's call to locate restoration of Montana's economy and life. Governor Schweitzer put it this way in his invitation letter to the conference. Throughout Montana and the West, we are seeing the emergence of a new economy. The goal of this new economy is to restore landscapes and ecosystems so they may provide increased productivity, ecological integrity, and business opportunity. The governor's letter observes that we may be in the midst of a new economic paradigm emerging in Montana. And he notes from Sealy to Colstrip, thousands of Montanans are participating in the restoration economy. Restoration not only cleans up a legacy of past mistakes, it provides a technological blueprint for doing it right in the future. Another really important part that's dear to my heart, and I know to many Montanans, is our constitutional context. The Montana Constitution declares that we have a right to a clean and healthful environment. And restoration fulfills one of these aspects in helping us to realize that dream by restoring the parts of Montana that are degraded. There's also a broader context as he's talking about restoration that goes beyond Montana, beyond this time and place. We live at the beginning of the 21st century in a legacy of ecological degradation that's occurred worldwide. Montana has a particular angle on this. Our traditional economic reliance on resource extraction and what Storm Cunningham in his book, The Restoration Economy, calls the new development mode of any young economy, has left a legacy of ecological degradation that threatens not only the well-being of natural systems, but of our human communities as well. We're living in a time of global ecological changes and breakdown. Human effects on nature and natural systems are being felt worldwide, with worldwide ramifications such as climate change, from which Montana is not exempt. But in the midst of this sobering news comes the good, and that's what I would say is the emergence of this ecological restoration as a practice and as a paradigm. In the past 20 years, we have witnessed the emergence of a community of practitioners of restoration who have developed both the know-how and the commitment to begin reversing this tide of ecological degradation. This development of restoration as both a scientific practice and as a paradigm shift for how humans relate to nature raise an important question. Are we witnessing a shift to an ecological framework for both the economy and our communities? And that's what I want to explore a little bit more with you this evening. Now, there are several key stakeholders that come together in restoration and are present throughout our conversation. It involves local, state, and federal government in lots of different branches. It brings together conservationists with people in the private sector. I think University of Montana and the other universities in the state system here have a key part of this as both educational and research communities. But I think most importantly, it has a way of involving local communities and citizens in this. And I want to emphasize part of the hopeful vision I find is the way it integrates communities and helps them become restored to their land as they restore the land around them. I would lift up one additional key stakeholder that's not as visible in this room. And it's always ironic to me that we do these wonderful environmental discussions in high-tech rooms with no windows, so we can't actually see. We have a nice built environment, but not much natural environment here. But I'd like us to keep present here Montana's native flora and fauna as the other key stakeholder whose voices we have to represent in the room, particularly a room like this. Restoration makes visible the presence and value of Montana's incredible diversity of plants and animals and the value they have for their own sake, quite apart from any value we may find in them. Just a footnote here, I'm teaching a class right now exploring ethical issues in ecological restoration. And one of the dangers of moving restoration into an economic framework, a restoration economy, which is what we're talking about tonight, one of the dangers, though, is that things quickly can become commodified. They quickly become valued only for the economic value they have. If we start trying to commodify and put a price tag on Montana's native flora and fauna, I think we really have moved away in some serious ways to what a restoration vision should look like here. So I hope we keep them present in our discussions tonight. So how then do we define ecological restoration? I'd like to start with a simple description that comes from Eric Higgs, who is a philosopher and former president of the Society of Ecological Restoration. He writes the following: ecological restoration is a worldwide movement of people who are assisting the recovery of ecological and cultural integrity. A worldwide movement of people assisting the recovery of ecological and cultural integrity. I ask you to note one important thing about this definition. Ecological and cultural integrity are linked. The restoration and recovery of both is involved in ecological restoration. Now, restoration is one of a family of RE words. We have all sorts of different things that we can talk about: reclamation, remediation, rehabilitation, revegetation, regeneration, all sorts of different notions on that here. And it's related to them, but it has some distinctive qualities here. Now is not the time to delve into all their differences, but if we look briefly at two of them, reclamation and rehabilitation, we can see both what's in common but also what's distinctive about restoration here. Reclamation probably is most known from its original context that stems from the Reclamation Act of 1902. The early reclamation movement focused on reclaiming land and water for human use, especially in the West. This was the period of large irrigation systems, of building dams, of reshaping the land to make it fit for agriculture, for rangeland, and so forth here. And so this original context of making the land fit for cultivation and making it useful to humans has been very, very influential in the heritage here. Now, reclamation as a movement has moved from that. I think it's incorporated many more restoration kinds of aspects there, but it still has as its aim to reclaim land to a useful or proper state for human use. That is, reclamation at its heart historically has had a utilitarian focus. What can we do with these resources to make them work for humans? And ironically, reclamation has oftentimes led to ecological degradation, particularly in the arid West, where so much can turn place around water. Moving from reclamation, there was a whole movement towards rehabilitation. And rehabilitation, defined a little bit differently, it seeks to return a damaged site to a predetermined condition that is desirable. Here again, the standard usually is what's desirable for humans. And so in that sense, rehabilitation differs somewhat in terms of both goals and strategies from restoration. If you note here, rehabilitation is a reparation of a site for products or services. It can be things for grazing capacity, for wildlife habitat. They can have ecological ends. But they're not doesn't necessarily involve the reestablishment of pre-existing plants and animals or biotic integrity in the site there. Can, but it doesn't necessarily have to. So then, what is ecological restoration? How does it relate to these movements here? Here's a definition that the Society for Ecological Restoration coined in 2002, which I think is a helpful place for conversation. Restoration is an intentional activity that initiates or accelerates the recovery of an ecosystem with respect to its health, integrity, and sustainability. And that notion here. So notice a couple things about it here. Restoration is intentional. It involves human intention and planning here. But restoration, unlike reclamation and to some extent rehabilitation, takes its baseline or its criteria from the ecosystem. The ecosystem it tries to restore in terms of health, integrity, and sustainability. This is what most distinguishes it from the other RE activities. its focus on ecological integrity as the bottom line of restoration. And I want to argue against having that be lost when we talk about a restoration economy. A restoration economy can restore all sorts of things, but I think at its heart it has to have ecological integrity as part of that restoration here. Now, Eric Higgs and others have listed some elements to help us understand what this focus means here in terms of ecological integrity. And he lists 4 main things. We can move over pretty briefly here. The first thing is ecological processes and structures. These include things such as energy flow through an ecosystem, nutrient cycling, water cycling, horizontal and vertical arrangement of plants and animals, what ecologists would be able to tell us by studying any kind of ecosystem about the structural and biological features there. Ecosystems evolve over time to have an integrity of how these all interrelate. So restoration seeks to try to understand that and return that integrity there. A key part of that is understanding the native biodiversity in that area. What has evolved in that place in the relationships here? And this includes not only the assemblage of plants and animal species that are native to an area, but whenever possible, the restoration of the actual unique genotypes that developed in a particular place. Hence, for practitioners of restoration, the importance of on-site seed collection and so forth. My partner Pat oftentimes makes the point that a ponderosa pine and coalstrip is not the same as a ponderosa pine and flagstaff. They've evolved distinctly and uniquely in terms of place, and so that genetic distinctiveness is important to consider when we do restoration. But ecosystems also have a regional and historical context. Ecosystems are dynamic. They change across both space and time. And restoration, hence, is not so much to a specific point in time, a specific outpoint, but rather we're restoring to a trajectory, an evolving sense of time that's consistent with the region's history there. What we're trying to do is restore the integrity of the ecosystem so that they can continue to evolve on their own in continuity with their ecosystem history there. And finally, many, if not most, ecosystems have evolved with human presence and activity. So ecological integrity seeks to reintegrate human cultural practices in ecologically sustainable ways. Jake mentioned I taught in Iowa for 10 years. Increasingly we're aware, and part of my work there was the restoration of the tallgrass prairie. Well, we're increasingly aware that the tallgrass prairie evolved with a lot of human interaction, of native peoples intentionally burning the prairie to different areas there. And so when we start thinking about how do we reintegrate human sustainable cultural practices there. The bottom line, though, when we're talking about restoration is a shift to ecological thinking when we talk about restoring and relating to the land. And this is going to be a challenge because economics is through and through anthropocentric. It's human-centered. It's what we do with human-centered disease there. So to start thinking ecologically within an economic framework is a real challenge to the ways we've done things here, but I think has some real promise about this restoration economy. Now let me move briefly into, I've just got a few more slides here, this whole notion that if that's what restoration is, what makes good restoration? And here I'm shifting from the sort of scientific side to the ethical, moral side here. Make an argument about this. Eric Higgs and some of the others have talked about that good ecological restoration is rooted in recovering the value of ecological integrity as central to healthy human communities and economies. And there are 4 main elements in thinking about this. First, the damage caused by humans is repaired by humans. Here we undertake a moral responsibility to the lands in which we live, and their integrity, their value, their well-being. So we understand there's a moral responsibility to actually repair what we have damaged. Secondly, increasingly the technology and the science are available to do this. We have 20 or 30 years now of restoration practices, the full emergence of restoration ecology, technology and so forth. So we know in a lot of places that we can make a good start on restoring damaged lands. What is needed then to carry this out is a sense of moral responsibility and political will. And here again, I think we're in an important political context. We have government in the state right now that sees this as both a responsibility and is backing it up with political will to do something about this. And finally, when we understand what restoration is really about, we can understand it as a win-win situation. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum trade-off game. We can think about it as enlightened self-interest for humankind. that we all need a healthy, vibrant environment in which to live and thrive. But we also can look for the value it brings to the land itself as a vibrant, healthy nature. In his helpful article, What is Good Ecological Restoration?, Eric Higgs reminds us that the restoration is always both an ecological and a social act. And he uses a helpful diagram to show the expanding circles of restoration from scientific practice to economic activity to cultural practice. So just very briefly, when we talk about good restoration, key in that is understanding ecology, ecosystems. It needs to restore health and integrity ecosystems. But restoration practices always take place within a larger economic context. If we had unlimited resources, we could do unlimited restoration, but we don't. So we have to make hard choices about that, have to figure out what to prioritize, and think about working in things like efficiency in making our dollars go as far as they can. But restoration is also always a human cultural thing. So we need to look at the concepts of history, culture, society, politics, all those different elements, and who gets involved in making these different kinds of decisions here. As I mentioned before, I find a really key element to good restoration is that which involves community participation as much as possible, intertwining with professional and scientific expertise. It's one of the things I've come to love and really value about Montana, is how active the public gets involved in these different areas here. And so we have lots of different opportunities where the public, where communities can get involved, both with the planning and the carrying out of restoration here. So if I were going to move to summing this up and ask, what would a restoration vision for Montana look like in our current context? For me, one of the most exciting and hopeful elements of restoration is that in restoring the land, we have the possibility of restoring ourselves to the land. Montana is a land that is cherished by those who live on it and live in it. Restoration can deepen this connection even further. So a good restoration in sum primarily seeks to achieve a higher degree of ecological integrity, understanding humans as being integrated into this, so we reintegrate humans into ecosystems. Has some loyalty to past conditions. We seek to put ourselves back in continuity with the integrity that's evolved over time in the land there. So it can't simply be landscaping or reshaping to human ends. The ecosystems make a claim on us. Ideally, it seeks to involve the local communities to the extent possible, and it's framed ecologically. Ecological values have priority over utilitarian concerns, or at least have equal weight and grounding on them. So if we were to close them with the promise of restoration, I've adapted the Society of Ecological Restoration's mission statement to Montana here. And I would say the promise of restoration is in sustaining diversity of life in Montana and reestablishing an ecologically healthy relationship between nature and culture, between ecology and the economy here in Montana. I assume we'll do the conversation after the other folks have gone, Jake? Is that...
Yeah, let's save questions and discussions for that.
Here, so I will pass it on to, I think, is Pat going next?
Thanks, Dan. Our next speaker is Marnie Criley. She's the restoration coordinator for Wildland CPR. They are a national conservation group based here in Missoula that works to revive and protect wild places and also promotes watershed restoration work. They do this through a variety of means, but primarily road removal, the prevention of new road construction, and stopping off-road vehicle abuse. Marnie works locally, regionally, and nationally to promote road removal as a key component of forest restoration. She has also spent the last 10 years involved in on-the-ground forest and watershed restoration projects here in the Intermountain region. Marnie.
All right, thanks, Jake. Thanks, everyone. So I didn't tell Jake this, but I'm going to try to get in 2 short presentations for the price of 1.
Why not?
We'll see how it goes. If I start talking too fast, tell me to slow down. I want to get kind of specific. It was great to have Dan open things up with kind of a definition of restoration. And I want to talk about a specific type of forest restoration, which is road removal. And then I want to look at a specific county, Humboldt County in California, that really has quite a burgeoning restoration economy and maybe glean some things from their experiences that can help us here in Montana as we try to grow our own restoration economy. So let me start with roads and road removal. And how many folks here are familiar with the concept of road removal? All right, so some are, some aren't. Hopefully we'll have a few more R's by the end of this. Wildland CPR focuses on road removal on Forest Service lands. And the reason for that is that our national forests have 440,000 miles, give or take, it's actually probably more than that, of roads. It's enough to circle the equator 17 times. They are the world's leading road management agency. No other agency has as many roads as our Forest Service does. We recognize that roads are important for a lot of different reasons, but roads also have a lot of ecological impacts, negative impacts. They can bleed sediment into streams, impacting fish habitat and water quality. They can often alter the hydrology of a watershed. I mean, one of the main things that a road does is it compacts the surface under it and altering that hydrology. Roads fragment wildlife habitat. They act as vectors for invasive exotic species, and they're costly to maintain. So the Forest Service's road system of 440,000 miles has given them a $10 billion maintenance backlog. They don't come anywhere near to being able to maintain all the roads that they have. So this is why we've kind of focused on national forest roads for our work. All right. All right, so back in 2001, the Forest Service actually recognized they needed to address this road system, and they came up with a roads policy. And in that roads policy, they sort of talked about the idea of decommissioning around 186,000 miles of their roads. Now, decommissioning can be anything from just putting up, say, an earthen berm or a gate, to actually going in and removing a road, restoring the road contour, restoring stream crossings, and we'll see pictures of that in a minute. And that's the type of road decommissioning that I'm really going to focus on here in this presentation. So if the Forest Service actually went out and removed these 186,000 miles of roads, we feel like they would be doing a lot of good, not only ecological, but kind of socio-economic advantages to that. Road removal creates jobs, and that's what I'm going to talk about here mostly. It can improve hunting and fishing opportunities. It can help keep our drinking water safe, and it can save money on road maintenance, erosion repair, and sediment cleanup. And it's been found that doing road removal is a lot cheaper than going in after a huge road failure and doing that sediment cleanup. So there's a lot of reasons to do road removal. All right, so for those of you that aren't familiar with it, I put in a few before and after slides of road removal just to give folks a sense of what we're talking about. And as you can see, road removal involves heavy equipment. It involves the same people and equipment that it takes to put roads in. Those are the folks that we need out there taking them out again. It's basically just deconstructing the roadbed. So you can see on this road, you've got a cut slope over there on the right. Your fill slope is down here. And what this excavator operator is doing is starting to take that fill and put some of it back on the road surface to get that contour back. And it also looks like here that they're hauling some of it away in dump trucks. And that's to keep it from going into streams. They often have to do that. And these two slides are from a road decommissioning project in Northern California. So this is our before, and this is our after, the same spot. And you can also see here that they had to excavate out a stream crossing. That stream had probably been run through a culvert when the road was there. And the operator actually goes in, finds the original stream bottom, and tries to get it back to the original stream grade. You can also see here that we've got quite a bit of down woody material they put down to try to get the re-veg started back up again. Dan was talking about the importance of native plants. We encourage forests to use a native seed mix, which a lot of forests in western Montana are starting to do on their road removal projects. And also a lot of times the excavator bucket will take native soil, a native clump of vegetation, from just off the old road and put it onto the roadbed. It takes him 2 seconds to do, and it can really help get some of that native veg back in there. So this is what road removal is. I've got one more example. This is actually from the Bitterroot National Forest down near Darby. And here's our before, and here's our after. And again, down here, we've got a stream crossing. And those can be kind of expensive to deal with. Road removal is an expensive type of restoration work. So just kind of keep that in mind and talk a little bit about funding for some of this work later on. On this project, they used a native seed mix, and they've put straw mulch down and some large woody material as on the previous project. Okay, so after the Forest Service road policy in 2001, where they talked about this huge road removal effort they felt was needed, we contracted with the Center for Environmental Economic Development, also known as SEED, out of Arcata, California, to look at the benefits and costs of a national program for road removal on U.S. Forest Service lands. And while SEED's study looked at, the costs of road removal, and costs can range literally anywhere from maybe $1,000 a mile to, in some places in Northern California where it's steep and they have huge stream crossings, it's been up to $100,000 to do a mile of road removal. They looked at those, but they also looked at a lot of the economic benefits of doing this work. So things I mentioned earlier, like improving fisheries, improving water quality, improving hunting, things that are important to Montanans. But the one that I want to focus on here in the next few moments is the job component of it. So what kind of jobs does road removal provide for local and rural communities? Because oftentimes these are in rural areas. And what they found was that road removal can create long-term jobs. An estimated 3,069 people, and again, they were looking at all of our national forests all across the country, so that's what these numbers are. An estimated 3,069 people would work to restore natural areas annually for decades to come. Approximately 33 jobs are created for every $1 million spent removing roads. And then you have supportive services for those workers, which creates more jobs. All right, road removal tends to require local workers, and road removal, probably also stream restoration, more so than a lot of other types of restoration, like thinning, tree planting, where oftentimes you'll get crews that go around different regions of the country doing this work. With road removal, because it involves heavy equipment, it tends to be locally based jobs. So you've got heavy equipment workers, contractors, and engineers who build the roads would be hired to restore the roads. As I said, since heavy equipment is prohibitively expensive to move great distances, local contractors are usually hired for this work. Local folks can also serve as restoration workers, technicians, and inspectors. Road removal tends to pay high wages to local workers. Not always true, but has a tendency to, especially on government jobs, Forest Service jobs. In one rural western county where a significant forest restoration program is underway, and that's what I'm going to talk about here in a minute, 102 heavy equipment operators on average worked 61 days over a 2-month period in 2002, and their average wage was a little over $19 an hour. And then finally, road removal can stimulate the broader economy. So more forest health restoration would boost manufacturing, transporting, and selling of heavy equipment, which would generate, according to SEED, approximately $600 million for that industry. So we're talking about companies like John Deere, Kubota, companies like that. And as I said at the beginning, while what I presented are national numbers, these numbers can definitely be translated down to the state and even the county level, which is what I'm going to show you guys next. And one clear example of that is one of the largest road removal programs in the country, probably the largest, is just over the state line from us on the Clearwater National Forest in Idaho. They've been doing road removal with the Nez Perce tribe for 10 years now. They've removed about 500 miles of roads in those 10 years. And they have heavy equipment operators who depend on this work every year. both economically, but these workers also love doing it, and they don't want to do any other type of work anymore. They want to do this restoration work. So we're starting to build a workforce for this that love doing this kind of work. All right, before we get to Humboldt County, I have a few more before and afters. Again, these are on the Bitterroot National Forest, and this is a very recent road removal project. I think they just finished it less than a month ago.
Were these system roads, Marty?
These, I believe, were system roads.
Okay.
As you can see, they're definitely pretty well-used roads.
Seems to be, yeah.
But the Forest Service felt like, when they looked at their road system, that these were roads that were causing a lot of ecological damage, I think especially to fisheries. And they were extraneous to the road system. They had other roads going to the same places, and so they could get rid of these roads. And I think this particular road, the cost per mile was around $5,000. All right, now I want to take us to Humboldt County in California, and I'm kind of stealing this slide presentation from a friend of mine who presented this actually in Missoula a number of years ago. But when I look back through it, especially after the Governor's Forum, I was like, wow, this is very pertinent, so I think it's worth us taking a look at. So actually in Humboldt County, California, their restoration economy really kind of got started with road removal on Redwood National Park. And since that time, restoration activities have had a dramatic effect on the economy and the ecology of the region. And an important part of the work in Humboldt County kind of feeds around this organization called the Alliance for Sustainable Jobs and the Environment. And it's a steering committee of labor, environmental, and community leaders nurturing the creation of high-skill, high-wage jobs, restoring the natural environment in Northern California. And if we look at some of their values, we'll see that they're very similar to our values here in Montana. A healthy environment with revitalized fisheries, improved water quality and restored forests, and healthy workers. We have a living wage, benefits, safety standards, and job training, and that's a really important one. With road removal, we've seen that it really is kind of a high-skill job that takes a lot of finesse, and just because you own an excavator doesn't mean you can go out and just start doing road removal. So job training can be important for a lot of restoration work. And then perhaps most importantly in terms of their values is community-centered economic development that supports workers, not just businesses, and economic development that is appropriate for their unique natural environment. And again, I think that resonates here in Montana. Their goals are nurturing the development of a restoration economy and restoring the environment. And I threw in another picture here. This is actually a restored road here in Montana a couple years later with the native grasses coming back in. They also want to help build a restoration industry that creates jobs, pays living wages, and provides benefits to workers, and supports rural economies. So if we look at some of the conditions in Humboldt County, we'll see that they're fairly similar to conditions we see here in Montana. A decline in living wage jobs and an increase in service wage, part-time, no-benefit jobs. Economic development leaders who think business and workers are synonymous words. Plus rural communities at ongoing risk. Salmon declining and water quality decreasing. Natural resource management more hotly debated than ever. And a fire risk to rural communities, which is certainly a big topic of discussion in Montana and other places in the West. They've also found that a lot of their solutions are right in front of them. They have a significant local restoration infrastructure, and I'll speak more to that in the next slide. They have a deep love and commitment to local communities and natural beauty, and they have a lot of social capital, determined people who refuse to give up on the area. So here's just a few specifics on Humboldt County's restoration infrastructure. In 2002, restoration created roughly 240 jobs and leveraged more than $14 million into the local economy. Now, $14 million is double the value of their current commercial fish landings. And that, in the past, that's been a huge part of their economy, is the commercial fishing industry. And it was greater than 2/3 of their local agricultural sector. Humboldt County has become home to more than 50 local restoration businesses and contractors and more than 300 employees. And much like, I mentioned on the Clearwater National Forest that they have a partnership with the Nez Perce tribe. In Humboldt County, a lot of the restoration work involves tribes as well, and that's become a really important component, especially for job training. Humboldt County has a similar need background to Montana. Rural job loss, ecological decline, and current economic development just isn't doing it for the community. They also have a similar want background, a genuine desire to improve community integrity, ecological health, and way of life for working families, and an interest and curiosity in restoration among a diverse array of groups and individuals. And we saw that at the Governor's Restoration Forum. A pretty broad group of folks came. But one thing we have to recognize is that Montana does not currently have the funding mechanisms that support restoration in California, but we could. So if we look at California's funding mechanisms, we see that they have federal and state appropriations, largely for salmonid recovery. They have a series of voter-approved water bonds, and these are huge bonds. California is a huge economy, and these water bonds, I believe, are in the billions of dollars, providing a lot of money for restoration to benefit water bodies. They also have National Fire Plan money and private sector dollars. So, getting back to Montana, we want to think big here in Montana the way they've done in California, even if we don't have the kind of economy California has. So we want to look at creating an infrastructure for a restoration economy. And this can include things like assessing and planning for a state or county level bond initiative, developing a community development block grant proposal framed within a job creation economic revitalization package, and organizing for state level legislation to authorize funding for restoration work. And a lot of these issues came up at the Governor's Forum, and many of us are working on some of these types of proposals. It's also really important, and certainly true here in Montana, to build alliances with the working people, with the working folks, the folks who went out there doing this work. The experience in California has been that small contractors and owner-operators have a lot to gain from this work, and that we need to invest in training workers, both on the job skills and in political strategy. And labor can play a critical role here. But even though it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of effort from a broad group of folks, that the outcomes are certainly worth the effort. And here in Montana, we can work toward policy solutions, especially with a governor who's very interested in restoration, new and innovative funding mechanisms, state and federal appropriations, and hopefully we'll be seeing John Tester at some point trying to get us federal appropriations for restoration work. Incentives for participation from private landowners. And I think that's certainly an important component here in Montana. And finally, we want to see restored lands, restored communities, and a restored workforce. And that's what I got. And this is road restoration on the Clearwater National Forest, where they have road densities up to 30 miles per square mile.
Yikes. Okay, thanks, Marty. Our final speaker before we open it up for questions and comments is former Congressman Pat Williams. Pat served in the U.S. House from 1979 until 1997, and those 9 terms represent more consecutive terms of House service than any other Montanan. So Pat was with us serving Montanans for a long time in Washington, D.C. Since returning back here to Montana, Pat has been teaching at the University of Montana from his position as senior fellow at the University Center for the Rocky Mountain West. And as Dan and Marty have mentioned, Pat was also heavily involved with the Governor's Restoration Forum and the state's current efforts to create a restoration economy. So with that, Pat, we welcome you.
Thank you.
And thanks for dragging John over here for the handshakes.
Glad he came over here. And so those of you who came late, missed meeting John Tester, who came by invitation. Mine, I hope it was all right.
No, it's fine.
And I wanted to, as I've been trying to do with John, inoculate him early on the needs for restoration. Let's see, what's left to be said? I think you both did wonderfully. And maybe something like this. Have any of you ever played second base or outfield or watching the World Series? Is the game on tonight, by the way?
Oh, yeah.
Damn! Now I know where everyone is. Why aren't we there? If you've watched these players, whether it's women's softball or the World Series, the good players await the pitch. The good defensive players await the pitch, and they envision what's going to happen if the ball's hit toward them. They envision the immediate future. You've all seen Tiger Woods swing a golf club, or Jack Nicklaus, or when some of us were younger, Ben Hogan. They envision the swing. They envision where the ball's going. And maybe closer to home, being as we're hard on the banks of the Clark Fork River here, you watch good fly fisher people, they envision where they're going to drop the fly. You can see them thinking it through, right? Well, that's what we have to do with restoration. If you're trying to create a restoration, repair, reclamation industry, I think you need to envision it first. It's not that we don't have repair work going on in Montana of the 3 various kinds. We do, and have for a long time. But we do not consider it as an industry in Montana. So my efforts with Birchfield and Dan and Marnie and Brian Schweitzer and others has been to try to move our leadership, academic and political, including companies and workers through organized labor, to envision a restoration, reclamation, repair industry in Montana. And I think we need to understand where we want to drop the fly, or what we're going to do with the ground ball in advance, in order to know exactly where we're going and what our next play or our next move or swing is going to be. Despite the good work that Wildland CPR does on the ground, despite the good work that the environmental studies folks do intellectually, academically, and with very important papers and statements, which are used on the ground, Montanans remain ambivalent, I think, about restoration as really an industry, and ambivalence creates inaction. And inaction delays support. Restoration costs money. Without people's support, ain't going to get there from here. Got to get their support. They've got to understand it as a business and industry the same way they understand mining, the same way they understand timber harvesting. There are more jobs and more money in restoration than both of those other two put together. But we don't think of it that way, it seems to me. I think we are on the cusp in the Rocky Mountain West of an emerging industry, restoration. Both of my friends have gone through it with their slides. But whether it's creating local businesses, or landscape repair, or restoring wildlife habitat, or another list of a dozen things, we are on the cusp of envisioning it and then moving to make it a reality, I think, and I hope. Think what restoration could do to science alone. If the federal government really wanted to enhance science budgets for the purpose of restoration, we'd shine as the world's example. That too comes from envisioning it. There is, in yesterday's scars on the western landscape, tomorrow's pay dirt for this state. We have, I suppose, outside of Alaska, more abandoned mine sites and open leaking adits, the mine mouth adits, than any state in the United States. We have antiquated old dams. We know, we live with them here downstream on the Clark Fork. We have tainted soils and waters. We have the legacies, intended or unintended, of our resource extraction past. But we need to envision it as pay dirt. We need to envision it as tomorrow's economy in Montana and throughout the Rocky Mountain West. We can flourish through the revitalization of this badly, unnecessarily badly, scarred landscape of ours. That's not to say, again, and I want to be quick to say this, that's not to say restoration isn't going on now. It is. Thanks to Marnie and others. Thanks to the WildWest Institute folks. Thanks to Jake and others. Roads are either being repaired or coming out. Landscapes are being revitalized, restored. But Montanans remain, unfortunately, a little too ambivalent about it, as do most Westerners. And as I said, even though, I guess I didn't say this, even though the work is underway at the present rate, it'll take centuries to complete it. And in the meantime, we're going to have erosion and landslides and cost inflation. It'll cost your kids and grandkids a damn fortune to stitch it together again. We should get after it now. But it requires public support and encouragement, and that's what turning restoration into an industry means. And by the way, the public lands and waterways are the public's responsibility. And people say, well, where does the money come from? Where's the money for Baghdad coming from? We're restoring that, if we don't bomb it all flat first. So it is a public responsibility. And politicians should quit kidding. It's not cheap. You can't do it without ponying up money. Doesn't mean taxes have to be raised. Doesn't mean budget deficits have to increase. Simply means America follows a different compass. And here in the West, we can put thousands of women and men to work doing this and turn it into a real industry. And we can do stewardship contracts to some degree. Stewardship contracts have been bastardized by the federal government. I was the first sponsor and the only sponsor of stewardship contracts originally, and we passed them through the House, and then in the Senate they were turned into a work for fee process with a friend of mine, over my objection, amended a good stewardship contract bill to make it trees for service. My good friend's name is Conrad Burns. 15, 20 years ago, and he screwed up stewardship contracts. We can get back to doing them correctly, and even if we do them the way we do them now, they can be of some use in providing some private money, in effect, for this repair work. But they're insufficient under any circumstance to pay for the full cost of restoration. And the deep pockets of Atlantic Richfield and British Petroleum do have an end to them. They have a bottom. And so that does mean that the public is going to have to come forward to reinvest in itself and its own land. And if we have politicians who will lead and show the public what they'll get for their money through envisioning a new economy in Montana and the Rocky Mountain West, the public will say yes. Count on it. Use these dollars for that purpose. Count on it. So we got to see restoration and reclamation and rehabilitation for what they are. An industry with good pay and good benefits restitching yesterday's scars into today's sustainable landscape. Think of it this way. Mining has an association. Right? Mining association. Timber has an association. Timber association. Restoration doesn't have an association. Restoration doesn't have a trade show at the Metro in Billings. But it ought to. And there are businesses, large and small, out there waiting to strike. If our leaders will only have the good sense, the innovation and the courage to imagine this, to help us imagine it, and then to move it forward. I do want to say, not in a partisan way, but Governor Schweitzer gets it, and that's why he accepted Marnie and mine and Birchfield and George Dennison and some other invitations to hold the summit. First Restoration Symposium Summit down in Billings a few months ago. Steve was there and others. Dan, Marnie, Jake. And I think that's the beginning of what could be a pretty important, pretty significant reimagining ourselves on this landscape. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat, for those words of wisdom. And I guess I'd like to ask Marnie and Dan, why don't you guys come up here in front, and we'll open it up for questions and discussion about really how we take restoration forward in this state, across the region, and ultimately, really instill this throughout our whole, sort of national ethos. Questions, comments about what we've heard? Mike?
Well, I'm very much impressed with this information. But of course, the next question is, how do we get started? A joint, focused effort in this regard.
Like Pat just said, one thing, I think the governor's forum was a stepping stone towards that. But where do you think we go from here, Marnie?
Well, I think that a lot of folks who are at the governor's forum, especially here in Missoula, we've been trying to keep the conversation going and thinking about, how to really create a restoration economy in Montana. And, as I mentioned in my talk, a lot of it, it's going to be about having broad coalitions of people talking about restoration and pushing this agenda. And, one of the things that this has done here in Montana is kind of rejuvenate this relationship between labor and the environmental community, which I think has been a great thing. And it's kind of a win-win if we can get the restoration happening and get this relationship that used to be very strong between those two groups revitalized. But I think we also need, hopefully, to see something from Governor Schweitzer that says to Montana, I really believe we can have a restoration economy. I understand that it needs money, and so we need some money to kick it off. There's no denying that. So
that might be through some kind of a state
legislative package. Or even executive order. Mm-hmm.
Or,
yep.
Mike, at the conference in Billings, a Billings financier banker made a simple, but I thought really important statement. In answer to that question, he said, well, the first thing we got to do is quit wrecking the joint. We got to stop doing what the hell we did 50 years ago. We got to stop. We got to. It's not that we can't do development. We've got to do it a lot smarter and a lot better. And of course, there's a lot more. But at least, Mike, that was his answer. With regard to the labor thing Marnie mentioned,
Some of you here remember not that many years ago when labor and organized labor, the AFL-CIO, the Montana State AFL-CIO, and environmental groups, including Sierra Club, Wilderness Society, lots of others, were like this. They worked hand in glove with each other. It revitalized our communities. It made progressive policy possible on the landscape as well as in the courthouses and city halls. And what they need to, now they're like this, you know. They're starting to inch back together, and they're inching back together because now they see a common product. Labor sees jobs, and environmentalists see repair, all under restoration, and they're ready to come back together. If restoration can bring those two forces back together, I think it will do enormous amounts of good for the community and political structure in Montana.
Dan, you mentioned in your remarks that the universities and, again, some of the educational institutions have a role to play. How would you see them sort of assisting or catalyzing some of this work?
Well, yeah, that's a lot of my main interest, and I think there's a lot of different ways we can do it. One of it is we have got a lot of research capacity at our universities. We've got people who are trained in the sciences and the technology aspects and different dimensions. And so I've been working with Marnie and other groups and trying to build, you know, with you all, trying to really link community organizations with universities. We have students, we're training the leaders for tomorrow and our students, and I think getting restoration in on the, even in the conversation is really important in that. I know in environmental studies we have a number of students who are doing their master's thesis project on different aspects of restoration. We have some working with Marnie's group, some other ones there. So I think there are assets that the universities have that need to be made available to government, to private sector, to community groups in linking up these partnerships in doing that. So I'm very hopeful. I've been working with Jim Birchfield. We're trying to get a restoration kind of colloquium going here on the university campus in Missoula. Mm-hmm. There are a number of different people in forestry and environmental studies and elsewhere who are working on different dimensions of restoration. We want to have a kind of a unified response to these different issues here. One of the other things is Storm Cunningham. We didn't talk too much about tonight, but he's written a book called The Restoration Economy. Yep. He was a speaker in the Billings Forum. He has an institute called the Revitalization Institute. University of Montana is now going to be one of the partner universities in that Revitalization Institute, so we have some opportunities to work with a broader network outside Montana, but focus our efforts here. So I think there's lots of different avenues we can work on.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important that we think about working with other departments and other programs, you know, sort of, I mean, EDST, its nature is interdisciplinary, so students who are in that program, you know, you get that sort of cross fertilization, but I think it's important we get some of these other departments.
Well, and as Pat was saying, you know, there's been a tendency sometimes for labor and the environment in this community like this. Well, that's been true of forestry and environmental studies as well. Yes. But this is an area where there's a lot of joint interest. I mean, the College of Forestry and Conservation is developing a restoration ecology emphasis. They've hired a restoration ecologist. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of room for collaboration between that college and environmental studies and some of their other aspects, like the economics department. There, Tom Power's work has been really instrumental in some of this. So I think there's a lot of potential for interdisciplinary effort on this.
And specifically, just for everyone's benefit, what's the class that you're teaching?
I'm teaching currently a class called Ethical Issues in Ecological Restoration. We're focusing the class particularly on the Clark Fork watershed. Mm-hmm. So we looked at some of the work in forest restoration in Upper Lolo Creek. We're looking at Milltown Dam removal and the restoration of the two rivers confluence there, and the restoration of the Upper Clark Fork near Deer Lodge. And in each case, we've been trying to work with some of the different community groups who are working on that and getting student projects oriented towards that work.
I mean, ultimately, all of this work is place-based, but as you can see by the comments from all the speakers, we've reached, you know, sort of a bottleneck, if you will, a social and political bottleneck. And there is work happening, but again, it's not being channeled very well. We're not working in a very cohesive fashion. So a lot of what Pat is referring to is, as far as, you know, we're not going to get the political dollars, you know, funneling here until we have sort of the social acceptance. And that's a lot of, I think, the stage we're in right now. Yeah, hand in the back.
So I think it was today in the Missouri, the front page was on the accident in Milltown, And I think that demonstrates, just how little we know even about the most studied groundwater system in all of Montana.
Yeah,
And
good
so do
point.
we have the scientific background to be doing large-scale restoration on just kind of an economic scale?
That's a good question, and it's a very, very much debated question about the scale of doing restoration work. I mean, I think for me, there's a part that says there's so much that needs to get done, we need to start thinking big. But then there's a part that says there's a lot we don't know about restoration. If you just look at road removal, there is very little science on the benefits of road removal. I mean, intuitively, it seems like a good thing. And in the places we've seen it occur, it seems to be having certainly not any negative, at least not negative long-term effects. But there is no hard science on what it's actually doing to benefit the landscape. So, I think that's going to continue to be a really tough question. And I think, unfortunately, the funding or lack thereof for restoration often dictates the scale as well. So it may be a while before we see larger scale restoration efforts.
Well, one other side of that, I mean, one of the projects in the class I'm with is looking at is the Superfund restoration from Butte to Milltown. I mean, we've got 115 miles of the Clark Fork River, the EPA's going to be working in that. We're focusing on the upper Clark Fork, but talking about, huge amounts of physical work being there to actually remove contaminated sediments or do in situ replacement and restoration work on there. There's a lot of unknowns about that. I mean, restoration is a developing practice with where you learn as you go. But there's also a lot of increasing body of experience behind it. And so, yeah, there are things like what happened in Milltown. You can't anticipate everything. And of course, natural systems are dynamic and they're unpredictable. There are always going to be unintended consequences you have to account for. And that's when I put that notion about hopeful and humble, the humility comes in really thinking that we have enough knowledge to do this. The hope comes in that in many cases it's probably better to proceed with caution, but proceed nonetheless, than to simply leave it contaminated because we know what some of the deleterious effects are of just leaving it. And so that's for me why I don't want to let go of the ecological integrity dimension of it, because we have a long history of reworking the land to meet our own ends. But unintended consequences have oftentimes, people who left us these degraded landscapes were doing what was best available science in their own day. They thought they were doing a good thing. And some good things did come out of it. But the humility part comes in from, what are the next generations going to be trying to undo from our work if we're not more careful about it? So for me, ecological integrity has to be a component of that. And we have to constantly be not only doing it, but monitoring for it afterwards.
Good question. Yeah, right here.
I'm from the state of Vermont, and I'm just curious what is being done with the restoration of a lot of the roads there. We're 80% forested land, and we used to be 80% deforested agriculture. In our particular town, we don't have the dairies we used to have, and logging has been really curtailed because of the Forest Service. We're sort of the center of the Green Mountain National Forest Service area. And there's a real animosity going on right now because the federal government is trying to expand the wilderness area, and the townspeople have lost their logging jobs, they've lost their local economy, they're now having to drive an hour and a half away from town for jobs. And there was an attempt to expand the wilderness area. It was defeated. And a lot of
the rep and
because the local people said, we want to be able to go into this area. And so I'm just curious, are you talking about restoration in any of the East Coast states, and particularly New England? Is this happening?
So Wildland CPR actually does work nationally. And it's kind of funny you're talking about Vermont, because on 2 separate occasions, I was supposed to go to Vermont to either do a workshop, and both times, just by 2 fluke different things, they fell through. So I do know that there has been some road removal in Vermont. I think National Wildlife Federation actually has had some efforts in the past. But I don't know a whole lot about sort of the restoration movement in New England. I know community forests are a big part of kind of the New England culture. And I don't know how much restoration might be occurring on those, but,
That's more selective logging.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, what I do know about Vermont is certainly the majority of forest is in private ownership. You know, the Green Mountain and the White Mountain National Forests are national forests, but the majority of the forest is in private ownership. I do also know that, you know, in terms of sort of issues affecting water quality and just, you know, major erosional things, it's not as pronounced as you would find it out here because one of the soils, you know, we have much more granitic soils, which are highly erosive, or at least a lot of our mountains are made of that. And again, the Green Mountains are much older, so, you know, they're gentler. So I don't think that they have near to the extent of problems affecting the road system. But some of the other issues affecting, you know, the forests are very severe. You know, things like acid rain, you know, is certainly a big problem in the Northeast. But I don't know of, you know, a lot of real active restoration efforts. Marnie and I both serve on a National Forest Restoration Collaborative Committee, which is composed of, you know, different folks from around the country. And we don't have any representation from the Northeast. We do have some from the Southeast and the Southern Appalachians and those regions. But yeah, I'm not sure if we were very helpful in answering your question.
I think our issues right now are this wilderness expansion issue.
Yeah, and again, that's probably more issue over public uses, you know, than actual ecological concerns. Other hands? Yeah.
Actually, my question is similar to hers. I live up on the reservation. They're expanding wildlife corridors and moving people off their land after they buy the land. But for the people such as myself who aren't farmers, who aren't doing a dairy or anything, I would rather be next to a wildlife corridor than have to be forced to be moved off my land. And how do I integrate my economy with staying there, not subdividing, not doing anything like that, but actually have an economy from that land? They've expanded this grizzly corridor, and it's a wonderful thing, but I'm the last person left besides 2 others out of 28 people. And
So this is up on
this is up the
92?
same, yeah. And so, first time in my life, I have the best neighbors, but I have a lot of pressure to, you know, get along. And I don't want to go to Bitterroot. I don't want to go to another developed area. I chose this because of that. It was a degraded place when I moved there. They all got the idea, wow, this is great. That's why I bought it. So, my question is, I've tried to come up with all these different ecologically sound ideas. One is what I told Marnie. I was thinking of making up a cemetery where people get urns, and you plant a tree, and you put their name on a tree, and I don't know, restoring the land somehow in you know, collectively with these other entities that are already doing it anyway. I mean, I've separated out a tiny plot for our homestead, and the rest is basically taken over by llamas, deer, and grizzlies. But yet, you know, it's an issue here. And being white, I mean, I'm sure that can help, but
You own the homestead?
yeah.
How can they move you?
I didn't say that. I said my desire was to make an economy for myself and my family within a small, or work in collusion. I don't know what the native vegetation is, where the watersheds would be. Where would I get that information? I'm told that it'd be nice if you didn't have llamas. It'd be nice if you didn't have dogs, and that's true, but if I live out there in the middle of nowhere, everybody's hunting. The only thing that protects my family is when you know there's a hunter out there because my dogs are barking, or there's a grizzly because my llamas are right there. But they basically don't. I mean,
So
they
it's sort of
can't
like,
move me off. I'm trying to work in collusion with this entity anyway. Could there be a database? Could there be some way to actually access this information so that you can develop some kind of individual package that can help do some of these issues that you're...
well, yeah, I mean, I certainly think that it's worth, you know, contacting other folks in the tribe. You know, I don't know who has contacted you, you know, in terms of these issues. It sounds like there are issues in terms of, you know, conflicts with grizzly
Yes.
bears and people in the valley who have sort of working ranches or
Well, they've
working-
moved them out.
And they've moved.
They're gone. I'm the only one left.
Were you the only one that had private land?
No, they all had, it was all private at one time.
They just bought them out?
Yeah. Which, why? Yeah,
Well,
they
no,
did just-
when you say they're forced to move,
Well,
I
no,
couldn't
no,
figure out how
not
to.
forced.
Yeah.
No, they were not.
Yeah.
They were
At
offered
a
money to
gunpoint, they were offered a high price that I didn't get a
Yeah.
good glimpse at what their price was,
Yeah.
so I've decided to hold
Well,
firm.
again, you're going to have to initiate contact with folks in the tribe and talk to them about how you might be able to, I think, work with them
I
to
mean,
come up with.
the tribes have an active restoration
They do.
program up there, and they
Yeah.
have a lot of good database information. So if you're interested in, really seriously looking at restoration as part of where you're living, there's plenty of information there.
And don't you think it would be viable to work that into an economy for, couldn't that, are you talking about making an economy out of restoration? So personally and so individually packaged as this? For people such as myself who buy land, who bought land and would like to be.
Well, I think that's, that's a level of responsibility that, really comes back on the landowner. And
Yeah.
yes, we want to be encouraged, as conservationists and as conservation organizations, we would certainly, be trying to work with landowners who wanted to initiate those kinds of activities. But it's, again, sort of beyond the capacity of a lot of groups to be able to work, individually with, every landowner.
Right.
That's
I
sometimes
understand
tough.
that.
But there are some different kinds of incentive programs. I don't know if these are operational on the reservation, but if you look, talk with folks like Five Valleys Land Trust, that would, doing land trusts or conservation easements that would have a restoration component in them can be a way of integrating your piece of land into a larger landscape that's ecologically sensitive, that would provide you with some economic benefits as well. There's some trade-offs. It also puts limits on what you can do with the land. But what I like about your idea is it sounds like you're trying to be sensitive about what does it mean to own this piece of land as part of a larger landscape, but you still need to be able to live on it.
Yeah, and it basically comes down to a really ugly reality of like, okay, what do you do? You raise cattle, you're just degrading the land. I've got ground-dwelling birds, so I have to keep the dogs in this tiny area, which is fine. But what do you do with it since you're not grazing, making a dairy, chopping down trees, or, things like that. So I was just hoping there was some place to access that information. So I'll contact Five Valleys Land Trust if they would know. I have contacted the tribe and had some difficulty with them. So it's been certain people within the tribe that I guess I need to go through.
Well, that's the case with every bureaucracy. Other hand, Steve?
I think her question underscores the dilemma with rural Montana right now. It's hard to make a living in rural Montana under any circumstances. And while I endorse a reclamation and restoration economy as much as any of you here, it has to be a broad program that doesn't just empower heavy equipment operators. And this is the trick. The humility that gentleman up there said, this mistake was on the front page of Missouri Today. That's like Restoration 101. Silts in a backwater in a dam and they're losing equipment. I think this does need to start small. It does need to be humble. We need to learn from our mistakes, and I'm really hoping that a restoration forum from the governor's office, phase 2, will be next year, and we will learn about the mistakes. We will increase our vision for what we need to do and find better ways in this humility of doing it well, because the blending of science and practical on-the-ground stuff, we're all making mistakes. We all are. And we also are learning to try to heal this place. In the process, hopefully we can find people in rural economies that can do more than just get a bulldozer operator license, because I think that's the real question behind this. This will be a stopgap and wonderful thing. But I wanted to point out some things that I think we can do to raise money to get this to happen. We already have reclamation bonds for mining in this state. They're simply not enforced. We don't get enough money on the front end to do this. They should be fixing their own mistakes. But we have to be careful with that because they can choose to mine in other places and not here. Although the resources are here, we just need to enforce the laws that are already on the books. We're choosing not to do that. We had a coal severance tax in the state that was 28%. There's nowhere else they can go to get low sulfur coal but here. We need to get the coal severance tax back up to 28%. Focus where we're actually using fuels, and if they're play vehicles, you should pay to play. And that money would have gone into a restoration thing. Pat was years ahead of everybody in that one. Also, a sales tax on consumption, I hate to say it, but this state doesn't have any money. We're shuffling, we're fighting over crumbs on the table, all right, to fund anything in this state. And
One
yet-
social service against another.
Yes, and yet we have millions of tourists that come into this state already trained to pay a sales tax, willing to do so, using our services, and we don't even ask. I don't get that. It's a tax on consumption. If you consume, you should pay to consume. We can certainly figure out a way to exempt residents from a tax and make necessities like food, clothing, and shelter exempt from the tax. But I think monies from that state sales tax could also go into that. The wealthiest profession in the state right now are realtors. Why can't we figure out a way to put a 0.5% real estate transaction tax on real estate? I was at a forum with the WildWest the New West, a couple weeks ago. I was talking to a guy who sells only high-end ranches, $1 million, $14, $15, $20 million ranches. 80% of his business is reselling the same damn ranch he sold 8 and 6 years ago. And he's cashing in. 6% on the sales of a $14 million ranch is a lot of money. It seems to me that a 0.5% on that real estate tax could go into a restoration fund that would guess what it would do? It would improve the value of the real estate.
Steve, could I pigtail on that, because this reminds me of a conversation I just had this last weekend. I was with 12 graduate students from the Environmental Studies program. We spent 3 days over the Big Timber area, meeting with ranchers, meeting with the mining community, meeting with logging community, trying to build some dialogue between environmentalists and local folks. And we were hosted by John Esp, who's a local state senator, Republican state senator there. He had a very similar proposal, and in terms of a realty tax, because when we talked to a lot of the ranchers there, one of the things that we were stunned to find out is they are really opposed to land trusts and conservation easements, because it takes what they see as productive land out of the local economy. It gives wealthy people, who are by and large the folks who take advantage of a tax break, but it takes the income then for supporting their areas out of their bases. So the counties, like we talked to the Sweetgrass County Commissioners, really having a problem with this. So what John Esp proposed is, why not have he said a 1% realty estate tax, and he was talking about using it for property tax relief. But what if you had something like that where half of the percent went to property tax relief and 0.5% went to a restoration fund, so that you were, doing both things. You were giving some income to the local economies there that the county government needs, but also proactively, because the other thing we visited was we looked at a lot of folks who've been affected by the Derby fire, and the Derby fire burned 207,000 acres, a huge fire, but 60% of that was on private land. And it was very interesting to see, we had examples of visiting places where landowners had been proactive in trying to thin overgrown forests and stuff to try to get back to more natural conditions. And in those places, they actually were able to set back fires, do some things, and really control something. But in other places, the fuel load was so high, it just roared through. The local ranchers simply don't have the income to do the kind of restoration work they did. The restoration work that had been done have been largely wealthy landowners who kind of bought a hobby ranch. But what again, about using some way of being able to, because the ranchers we talked to want to get the restoration work done in their areas. They just simply don't have the income to do a lot of it. So how do we work with partnership? There's an effective way for government to work in partnership with folks and build support, as Pat was saying, build some kind of support basis for this that also develops the local economy, keeps them on the land.
And thanks for mentioning that, Dan, because I was tying a state sales tax to a relief in property taxes. And I also believe that this real estate transaction tax should be for property over 300,000.
Right.
I mean,
Set it as threshold level.
People who just want homes back and forth shouldn't have to pay more for the realtor. The realtor can cut their
Steve, do you think your ideas are more feasible than, for example, what Marnie showed us as far as some of the state bond initiatives in California? And again, I'm trying to weigh this in context with sort of the right-wing, sort of Republican, march on tax relief in this country.
It's going to be a challenge, but Marnie, you were talking about, California, Puget Sound, they have some serious amount of fishery monies coming in to do that stuff, and that's really important. And I'd certainly like to see enough recognition in this area for the headwaters for, erosion control and stuff too. But you have to you have to be careful. It's outside money coming in, and I'm just trying to figure out, their outsiders are
We
coming
need
in
our own
already.
source. We need our own source
We've
here.
got outsiders coming in
Yeah, yeah.
already with money, and I say, just, it's a different distribution of the wealth, and we should ask. We're not even asking. And I think we could get a huge fund from people who have money, corporations who have money, not from us. We should get the relief for it.
Well, here's one, Steve. You know, Schweitzer says, I'm not going to raise taxes. Now, he didn't say, that was last time. I don't know what he's going to do in this legislature coming up in January, but I don't think he's going to support raising taxes. But he is going to support collecting taxes. There's a difference. Out-of-staters who sell property in Montana don't pay taxes. 87% of them don't pay a tax. And we can't find them. We don't have the computer system to find them. Out-of-staters that own oil wells in Montana, oil and gas wells, they don't pay a tax. They're knocking it dead, and they don't pay a tax. So Schweitzer's got a way to close those loopholes. Now, if you close them, you raise more money than you do in the lottery tax and the liquor tax combined. Well, there alone's enough money for restoration. And you didn't raise anybody's tax, you just started collecting it.
From who should be paying?
Right.
From who should be paying, and pay everywhere else. They just don't pay here because we've had a string, frankly, we've had a string of very conservative administrations in Helena who don't want them paying. They didn't want those people paying, so they didn't.
You know, it's really hard to recognize this treasure state is no longer a treasure of oil and coal and gas. It's a treasure of perception of land value. And the brokers for that are not the Anaconda Company and Montana Power Company. The brokers are realtors. And I also want to throw one other thing as a question. Weeds. Weeds. Talk to me about weeds and restoration. And secondly, I'm trying to think more integratively about commodification. I don't think it's the evil. And if in fact, I'm just going to throw this out to you all, but if in fact you're going in to do a road restoration, and somebody should be able to analyze that forest around that road, and this is a unique question, but could there not be the potential for some commodification in a light way there, because it's your last chance in to do something better as you're pulling out?
Such as?
Say what you mean.
Healthy Forest Initiative stuff, but done in the right way, in the right watershed with a road there, not overdoing it, so that you're getting fiber, you're getting timber, you're commodifying what's there, but you're...
Well, that's like the stewardship contract.
Yeah, it's a stewardship. But then you're also removing your traces and the road,
Yeah.
and you've got slash for what you
Yep.
need to do,
Yep.
and you've got some soil
it's all-
damper stuff.
Yeah, that's possible.
Better utilized. So I don't see this as an evil.
Oh, no, I mean, I don't want to suggest that either, because I think it's an economic base. We're going to have to find some function of that. My concern is, and I think some of the folks in Billings said this too, restoration in some sense, even though we don't have an industry for it, but it is an in topic here. And so people toss around terms like restoration forestry, restoration this or that can be a pretext for some pretty nasty practices that don't, in my view, end up leaving anything restored. They end up being a pretext for it. So but I do think, on the other hand, I do think there are forestry practices that can really contribute to restoration. So what I was trying to give some criteria there is if we're going to use these terms, what are some of the things that need to be givens in that? And I think ecological integrity at least has to be protected, if not improved, in these practices. If it's not, then just don't call it restoration. Call it some other kind of thing. But I want to keep some notion that restoration means restoring something of value, and that something of value includes ecological value in that. But I'm not a purist in the sense that it's a total hands-off thing. I think it has to be, that's why I talked about the sustainable human practices that have to be reintegrated in the human communities have interacted and used, these ecosystems for millennia. And some have done it in more sustainable ways and some have done it less. And so what our goal is to build an economic framework that is a much more sustainable way of doing it.
Here's an example. Jeff and I were just down in the North Fork district of the Salmon Channels today. We were looking at a bunch of fuel reduction, and we were also, of course, looking at some forest restoration work. There's a lot of gray area when it comes to fuel reduction. And again, those things, forest restoration and fuel reduction, they get melded together and they don't always come out, looking the same or, accomplishing, those kind of ecological goals. So there's no question that taking a road out, while you're doing some thinning that can then allow fire back on the landscape. Those things are all very, very, possible, in the type of, climate that we have now with, a lot of money going in for, Healthy Forest Initiative, Healthy Forest Restoration Act. But our job, of course, is to make sure that some of this other restoration is also being accomplished while we're doing stuff that takes care, of the vegetation. And that's the part that often is not followed through on, or the forest isn't looking at the whole picture. So absolutely, Steve, it can be done.
And restoration is a wonderfully broad, gray area. And it's wonderful in that regard because you can kind of pick and choose what ecological stasis you want to achieve, really, for whatever purpose.
Hey, it's getting late. Anybody got any last questions? Or, yeah, right here in the middle?
Quick,
Sure.
simple one. Kind of a different focus. Going to ask you to use your imaginations really quick. Look into the future. What would a vocational education program for the restoration economy look like? And what equipment would be needed?
You want to try that, Marnie?
I'm gonna let Dan try that.
Well, I'll give a stab at it here. I mean, one of the things that I would love to see linked more is linking the scientific educational aspect with the social educational aspect. That the restoration is not just a technology; it's a social practice. And so we do really good, I think, at separating those. We train people to have really good scientific technical skills, but don't really have them think about the broader social context in which they're operating. Then we train people to think a lot about the social side or the ethical side, but don't really have the experience of the practices. I'd like to see an educational program that integrates those, and that's what we're looking at. I mean, that's one of the things we're actually looking at. Jim Birchfield has the same interest here, College of Forestry, and so with their restoration ecology emphasis in forestry, we're really trying to think, how do we build in a social dimension of that? I mean, I'll put my bias here. I think everybody should have an ethics class in there to talk about not just what is ecological restoration, but what is good ecological restoration and why. So that from the very beginning, we're thinking about restoration as a broad social practice. And then I'd like to see it intentionally be part of, have community planning as part of it, so that when we start thinking about restoration, we're talking about who's involved, whose voices need to be involved, how do we expand the circle on that. Conflict resolution. I mean, there's several different components that I think need to be part of that. I think that the problem sometimes is restoration programs have been fairly fragmented. They've either been science-oriented or technology-oriented or practice-oriented. But we need a much broader, more integrated approach, would be my bias.
A vocational school approach, different perhaps in a university such as this one's approach. It would seem to me would involve a number of facets, including small-scale restoration skills, as well as large-scale restoration skills. Now, by large-scale, I mean some of Marnie's photographs on taking out roads. That requires heavy equipment. If done correctly, and I assume Marnie's correct that we're not sure about the science of it, what the science of it's going to tell us, but if done correctly with heavy equipment, some care taken, I think it can be done, correctly without, as that guy in building said, wrecking the joint. It does seem to me that also gives us an opportunity to bring people who care about doing it correctly, like both Dan and Marnie, together with organized labor who really cares about large-scale jobs. That's not their sole care, but they're used to large-scale jobs with heavy equipment. The operating engineers, International Union of Operating Engineers, is the primary union in Montana and America to do this kind of heavy equipment work where it's appropriate on the landscape. The secret of the operating engineers is that for the first time in 100 and more years, they no longer have a really top-notch apprenticeship program. They just don't have one anymore. And they're looking to, pardon?
Is it a capacity issue?
I don't know. They let it languish. They didn't have the money to put in it. The equipment took fewer workers. They had fewer members, and it was a cycle. couldn't properly fund it anymore. But I also think they sort of let it languish. The operating engineers are now, at least some of the savvy people at the top of the operating engineers, including a couple of leaders here in the Montana Union, are looking to the vocational schools to use the value of the operating engineers' old apprenticeship programs, which were really and truly among the best apprenticeship programs in the world, to retool the apprenticeship to fit restoration techniques, but with heavy equipment. And the federal government, I know from some work I've been doing on it over the last 6 months, the federal government thinks there's a federal role to this, and therefore thinks that they could assist with some direct money to vocational schools for the purpose of apprenticeship programs solely for restoration. And so labor and environment is coming back together that way too, with educators thrown in for good measure. So, the beauty of the larger word restoration, I think Dan's right, we got to keep it specific so we know what we're talking about. But the beauty of restoration is not just what it does to the landscape, to the natural landscape, but what it does do to the human landscape, the policy and political landscape of bringing old allies back together, re-educating Americans, and having us make choices about where we want our valuable tax money to go. Restoration does all those things, and I'm sure a hell of a lot more that maybe none of us are wise enough to understand yet.
I think the only thing that I would add is the importance of local knowledge to the restoration effort, and the importance of having the classroom be outside and not in here for efforts, because that's where we learn it, that's where we see it, that's where we learn from our mistakes. And a lot of these, some of these operators that have been removing roads in the Clearwater for 10 years, they've learned the science of it. They know it. And you're not going to find them in a classroom somewhere. You're going to have to go to them to learn their knowledge about the restoration work. So,
real good question though about how we build a
Yeah.
local workforce.
Yeah.
It's a huge issue. Last question, if you would, please.
Oh, yeah. I just had a comment and a question. Going back to sort of where we go from here in education and bridging the two sides, and also just to make a plug for the Wilderness and Civilization program, which is in the School of Forestry. We took a class from Pat, we visited the Clearwater and Wildlands CPR, and it's within the School of Forestry, a lot of forestry students, but also a lot of EVST kids from all sorts of backgrounds. We're visiting loggers, ranchers, miners, people that work at the dump at the pulp mill. So just a really good look at integrating what's happening here in Western Montana and really building bridges in all areas right here. And so I thought that it's just a really great example, when you're mentioning School of Forestry and EVST, they're really
It's another good avenue.
together. Mm-hmm. And then I had just a quick question. What does the restoration look like in eastern Montana? I'm more familiar with western, but there's not a whole lot of forests out there. Is it more work with water or bioremediation or?
I don't know a lot about it myself.
Well, my first response is again, Pat quoting the businessman in Billings. My concern about eastern Montana is not so much what needs to be restored,
Right.
but what potentially could need to be
Right.
restored if all the development plans go ahead in terms of coal bed methane and everything else out there. We could be looking at a real ecological disaster that would be incredibly expensive to restore. One of the really important points that Storm Cunningham made about the restoration economy is he says that restoration now for the first time gives us a price tag for what ecological degradation costs. We now increasingly know how much it costs to restore damaged ecosystems, and usually it's far, far more expensive to restore them than it would have been to prevent the damage in the first place. So in eastern Montana, I just get nervous when I see all the different proposals for the kind of development that's going to be going on there in terms of if we take restoration seriously. There's some real potential problems.
If you remember Dan's 3 definitions, there may be more opportunity. I don't know this quantifiably, but there may be more opportunity for reclamation and rehabilitation in eastern Montana with regard to the farms, the ranches, the overgrazed riparian areas.
Yep, along those.
Not to turn them back, although there is that idea for the American prairie, you know, the buffalo back, am I using the right term, American prairie?
Commons.
Yeah, the old commons. There is opportunity for that, which would be restoration. But people do live out there, they do have farms, they are working farms, some of them have been abused, some of them haven't. So there's rehabilitation and reclamation work possible out there that they would support. They would support. And so I think all that comes under this rubric of, you know, getting after it, getting on with it, and imagining ourselves on a new landscape.
And I would just put one last thing on there, because I think Pat's brought the point up nicely. All those RE words can go together. I mean, you can have, we saw a really good example of a ranch out near Deer Lodge where they're going to be restoring a stream bed. So real ecological restoration for the riparians on the stream bed, but it's going to remain a working ranch. And so they're going to rehabilitate the grassland component of it, not restoring completely, you know, and reclaiming some other areas. Those can be an integrated vision. And I think that the unifying factor is that you restore some ecological health to the process so those lands are somewhat self-sustaining.
And more productive.
And more productive too, right.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of speaking in more, you know.
Now, the other thing is this, I don't want to hold you, but I want to quote Muhammad Ali, so I know you'll stick around. A lot of this is not crap. A lot of this is up to you students. It is. It's up to you students. And the job a lot of you gave me and kept me in for so many years in Congress, I got to meet a lot of my heroes, and one of them was Muhammad Ali. And I went to a school with him one time, and as we were leaving the classroom, we were leaving an auditorium with all the classes in the auditorium, and a little kid yelled, "Wait a minute, wait a minute." And so Ali stopped, you know, on the way out, and the little kid said, "Aren't you going to give us a poem?" Because Ali used to rattle off these poems for people, and they were funny poems. And Ali stopped and then kind of walked back to the center of the gym and said, "Well, okay." And then he said, I don't want to demean anyone here, college students, but he said to these little kids, after he thought for 30 seconds, he said, "Okay, here's my poem for you. Study hard and stay in school. If they can make penicillin out of bread, they can make something out of you." So you're the answer, I'm serious.
So let's start making some penicillin, huh?
All right, thanks for coming, everyone. The next Nature Forum is on the 14th of